Japan, a land of quiet dignity, ancient culture, and noble traditions. The recent TV series Shogun has brought the beautiful complexity of Japanese culture during the 16th and 17th centuries to life for a fresh generation. But as the richness and vibrancy of Japanese history has been popularized and laid out across our TV screens, fans of the Napoleonic era could be forgiven for being puzzled by a very simple question. Why don't we know more about Japanese history from the Napoleonic Wars? Tonight, in a long overdue installment of the Napoleonic Wars pod, we try to right a significant omission in the show's back catalogue. Thomas Gidney joins us to explain why Japan was struggling with efforts to maintain its isolationist stance, how the Russians had particular designs on opening up the region to trade, and why Napoleon might actually have helped Japan remain closed to European influence. This is Japan in the Napoleonic Wars. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all well. Welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, Josh Redden. Alongside me today, virtually, is my dear friend, Dr. Zach White. Zach, how's it going?
I am well, thank you very much. Is this interview number 3 or 2, or I've forgotten how many you've done at the helm now?
For me, it's 4, so it's getting habitual now. Finding my wings, hopefully.
You are indeed. Yeah, it's a different one this time. We should, well, I say we should probably apologize to our guest. I should probably apologize to our guest because they have been badgering me to do this interview for quite a long time. And this is genuinely part of the impetus behind us bringing in more people to work on production so that we could expand what we're doing, and make more time for interviews like this. But this is going to be a fun one. Who have we got?
So, in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Thomas Gidney. Thomas is a research fellow at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He completed his PhD in international history in 2021, and he's currently in the process of writing his book, which is entitled An International Anomaly: Colonial Accession to the League of Nations. But among one of his other expertises is Japanese history. So, who better to have on the show today? Thomas, welcome, and how are you?
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and no worries, Zach. It's as I was saying before, it's a history from 2 centuries ago, so it's not going anywhere.
It's not, but equally, like, you have waited about a year and a half for this interview, so I feel very bad about it. Um, and we were discussing at the start the fact that this might need to be a two-parter because trying to cram all of this incredible history um, into a 60-minute episode is probably too much. Um, where to start with this? We're not going to start with Shogun. We will double back to Shogun. If people don't know what Shogun is, HBO did a TV. It's like the Japanese Game of Thrones. That's how people are describing it. It's based on a historical novel, and it looks at kind of the origins of the shogunate. It is incredible. I have no idea if it's historically accurate, but it is incredible. And it gives you such a kind of respect for the vibrancy and just how poised I think Japanese culture is. Like that contrast. Sorry, we've gone off on one on the Shogun, like rabbit holing on this show. We do it. But just how kind of if you compare what European culture is like to what Japanese culture is like in the period that it's set, Japanese culture is so much more sophisticated. And all of these kind of ideas that Europeans have of, oh, these people are barbarians, is just kind of thrown into such beautiful relief when you see the realities of what Japanese culture was like during this period. So, do we start with Japanese culture? I suspect that's probably the smart place to start to give people kind of a bit more of a grounding of how of people's mindsets, I guess, in Japan during this period. How, I mean, here's a big question. What is Japanese culture like during the Napoleonic era? Like, feel free to take up the next hour and a half just answering that question. But That is kind of my really badly formulated question.
Well, gladly. And Japan at the turn of the 19th century. So I'm going to sort of put the Napoleonic Wars between 1790 to 1815 in this time frame, but we're looking at a culture that is very different from what we might know today. First of all, Japan is unique in its level of isolation from the rest of the world. So Japan had essentially been subject to a policy called sakoku, which in Japanese means a country chained shut. So it was completely isolated, with one major exception to European influence. It did retain some diplomatic and trade missions with some of its neighbors. So it retained trade with China, with Korea, and also with the indigenous people of the Japanese islands, who are not actually the Japanese, but another group, another populace called the Ainu, who at this period inhabited the islands just north of Japan, which are today contested between Russia and Japan, called the Kuril Islands. And trade was negotiated through what were essentially called portals. So these were unique trading ports which had unique relations with these countries. But no other European nation was allowed to conduct trade with Japan, with the exception of the Dutch, which we will get to later. Nonetheless, despite Japan's isolation, this was actually an era of prosperity, an era of economic development, and this was markedly contrast with the era that which we see in Shogun in the 1500s, which was an era of civil war, an era which in Japanese is called the Sengoku Jidai, so the Warring States period. So I think in a way, this era which comes after the Warring States is prosperous due to the peace that is brought around, which we do see in the Shogun series.
You've set that up beautifully. So I'm going to bite on that worm that you've attempted to hook me on. That if I was a fish, I would be dead in like 30 seconds. I wasn't expecting to kind of go down that analogy when I started that sentence. Um, Shogun, I watched it very recently, so I'm a newcomer to what all the hype was about. Um, Personally, I loved it. The whole way through, though, I was just thinking, I have no clue how historically accurate this is or isn't. Like, I'm expecting it to maybe visually hit the mark, but in reality be a long way from reality. I gather that the characters themselves are broadly fictionalized, but based loosely on sort of individuals who contributed to the conflict that sort of leads to the establishment of the shogunate. That's my very limited understanding of it. But for you, as somebody who has a better grasp of the history of the region, did you look at it and just sort of put your head in your hands and think this is absolutely diabolical? Was this sort of the Ridley Scott of Japanese history? Or were you looking at this kind of going, actually, this is okay?
I genuinely enjoyed the Shogun series, and I realized that it's not always in academia the safest option to endorse a popular TV program, especially after, yeah, as you said, that we have monstrous examples and of late, such as the Ridley Scott's movie on Napoleon, which I think was a great disappointment to many listeners. But I think that Shogun, even though it is a semi-fictionalized version, it does follow a lot of the main patterns of what occurred around 1600, which was essentially a reunification of Japan. I think that there have been developments from the original TV show, which came out in the 1980s, which is, I think, reflects the changing historiography towards the level of Eurocentrism in how we write history. I think in the 1980s version, James Clavell's character of Blackthorn is essentially given a very significant role in how much he impacts the Civil War, versus in the more recent version where he is a sort of side character to Lord Toranaga, who was a stand-in for Lord Tokugawa, who was the real historical figure. And essentially, he doesn't necessarily usurp the storyline, I think, in the same way that he might have done in the 1980s.
And can I just again just trying to sort of get people's kind of mindset in how Japanese society is structured. Where are we in that process? You know, from my very limited understanding, you have an emperor figure, you have the shoguns, but I don't really understand how it all slots together. So just kind of give our listeners a sense of, I guess, the sort of political slash social construct of Japanese society during this period, because that's, I suspect, going to influence how we understand the way in which policy develops.
So I think if you were to have a quick look at Japanese society in this period, it would resemble something akin to the feudal structure. Now, I know that a lot of medieval historians would probably resent the comparison, but I'll sort of use the pyramid that was often seen in feudalism as a sort of example of how Japanese structure is based. So at the top, there is the emperor, but unlike modern Japan, where the emperor becomes the sort of the main political figure, in medieval Japan, the emperor has sort of been reduced to a religious figure who usually will not involve himself in the temporal dealings of the different lords that essentially conduct most of the politics of Japan. The emperor resides in Kyoto at this point, not Tokyo, which as if you've watched the Shogun series, you realize is actually just a fishing village in 1600 called Edo, which will then blossom post 1600 as the new capital due to Tokugawa. But below the emperor is the political leader of Japan, which is the shogun. So it would be difficult to directly translate what this means, but some would call it the military dictator or the king. But essentially, it's the temporal, more secular leader. So they don't necessarily have the same religious functions in the Shinto religion, but they wield considerable political power. And there had been a shogunate in the 13 and 1400s under a different clan called the Ashikaga. Now, when their shogunate collapsed, it launched the civil war in the 1500s, which is what brings the Tokugawa clan to power, essentially, by the end of the 1500s, early 1600s. Now, the war was conducted by different lords called daimyo. So these were essentially lots of local warlords, and below the daimyo were the very famous samurai, who would inhabit a role similar to knights. So the samurai were usually connected to a daimyo, so they would serve a daimyo and pledge fealty to a daimyo. Now, below the samurai, and this is where it gets interesting, is with the more common folk, if I can use the old term. So in Europe, I think we would have seen the peasantry as perhaps closer to the bottom of the pyramid, but this isn't necessarily the case in Japan. Now, obviously, the peasantry are not powerful, but they are often given a higher regard in Japanese society to artisans. And it's something, I think, related to Shintoism and the connection to growing products from the earth, where the artisan is more is manufacturing something is sort of secondhand from the earth. And at the bottom of the scale, even though they're one of the wealthiest classes, are actually merchants. So in this sort of system, merchants were not necessarily given a lot of respect, but could often be wealthier than many of the other classes, even samurai. In many cases, this pyramid also becomes highly affected by the conflict, and I think we'll go more into how the social pyramid is disrupted by the conflict in the 1500s.
That's really interesting. I never knew that about the merchants and peasants and the kind of the nuances of the Japanese like social structure. So to circle back to this imperial policy of Sakoku, you speak about diplomatic isolationism. It begs the question, what is Japan's connection then to the Napoleonic period? Because I mean, it's obviously not the first country we think of in connection to the wars. So why is Japan relevant in spite of its diplomatic isolationism, and what is the connection of Japan to this largely European or at least Atlantic conflict?
Can I just say before you answer that, Thomas, not for the first time, it's the new recruit who is bringing the show back to the Napoleonic era and keeping us on topic.
I was dragging us out the rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, this is kind of, I think you're going to be more popular with the listeners than anybody else on this show because you don't indulge him, or you do indulge in my rabbit holes, but you then bring us back on track. So good job.
Oh, thank you.
Good job, Provost Marshal, as you are nicknamed.
The significance of Sakoku is that around the 1800s, we start to see many European nations that are interested in opening Japan up. The main nations that are involved here are Britain and Russia. And essentially, they're trying to break a monopoly that is held by the Dutch. And the Dutch hold this monopoly because of some important decisions that they made back in the 1500s. So I'm sorry if I'm bringing us back to the Shogun period, but it's important to understand this.
Can I just say, I love that. Josh tries to bring us back to the period of the podcast focus, and us two academics are just like, no, we're doing context today, people.
The historians want to talk about Shogun.
Yes, no, I will try and bypass the actual Shogun bit, but the understanding the European contact with Japan is very important in understanding why Europeans were trying to access Japan in the Napoleonic period. So during this Civil War era in the 1500s, the Portuguese arrived in 1543, and they brought two very disruptive influences into the country. The first being Christianity, which upturned a lot of the social pyramid, promising universalism and the equality of man, but also leading to the Portuguese gaining a considerable amount of influence via their Catholic followings, as well as several daimyo who also converted to Catholicism, which is also shown in the show. But secondly was the introduction of gunpowder weapons. Now, gunpowder had been introduced and used for several centuries in China, but was less utilized in Japan. And what we're talking about is the arquebus. Now, the Japanese were very adept at copying the arquebus into a gun called a teppo or Tanegashima, which is the island essentially where the Japanese were supposedly the best at copying the gun. And the gun also changed the social model because now a peasant armed with a gun, a peasant with very little training, could now shoot a samurai who had essentially devoted his life to training to be a military combatant. So the gun essentially changed the logic of the war, and many warlords jumped on the opportunity of manufacturing or importing as many guns as possible. So it could turn essentially a relatively weak daimyo who had access to European trade into a very powerful daimyo very quickly. So guns are in a very important element. I think, that, again, in the Shogun show, you will also see the use of gunpowder weapons too. So the show Shogun is really based around the year 1600. So this is when Lord Toranaga, who in reality is Lord Tokugawa, who is seen as the third great unifier, because there have been two attempts before that to unify Japan, Tokugawa being the third, but the successful one, essentially becomes shogun following the Battle of Sekigahara, which was a gigantic battle between the warlords of generally the east of Japan and the daimyo of the west, who were defending the interests of the son of the late ruler of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had not come to age yet. So Tokugawa used the opportunity of the boy's youth to essentially launch a bid for his own control of Japan. Now, following the end of the conflict, Ieyasu, or Tokugawa Ieyasu, saw Christianity and gunpowder, even though he had dabbled in both, not becoming Christian himself, but had certainly interacted with Christians and had allowed a certain level of Christianity to operate within his territories, had sought to dampen down the influence of Christian missionaries, and had also sought to curtail the use of gunpowder weapons, certainly among the peasantry. But it was really his grandson, third shogun of this dynasty, Tokugawa Iemitsu, that really began to clamp down on interactions with Europe, as well as on Christianity. And this followed a large-scale rebellion in Shimabara province, which is in southern Japan, close to Nagasaki. And this was essentially a peasant rebellion. There's a lot of debates among historians whether the rebellion was actually caused by economic grievances, but many of the rebelling peasants were Catholic and held Catholic banners, and essentially it was useful for the government to sort of pin Christianity as the main factor as to why this rebellion had kicked off. Now, following the rebellion, Christianity was banned on the pain of death. Christian missionaries were banned. There's also a great movie by Martin Scorsese, I think Silence, which follows this history of Portuguese missionaries attempting to get into Japan during this period. But also all trade with other European states was cancelled, with the exception, as I said before, of the Dutch. Now, why the Dutch? Well, first of all, the Dutch were not interested in proselytizing to the same extent that the Portuguese had been. But the Dutch had also played a clever political game. So during this rebellion, the government required essentially Dutch ships and their cannon to besiege the castles in Shimabara. And the Dutch, despite the fact they were opening fire on fellow Christians, did not necessarily see them as fellow Christians, because the Dutch were Protestant, and most of the rebels were Catholic, and were seen as potential allies of the Portuguese. So the Dutch, much to the shock of most Europeans when news came back to Europe, threw that lot in with the Japanese government. In response, the Japanese gave a certain privilege to the Dutch, which was a small artificial island of about 2 acres off the coast of Nagasaki called Dejima. And this island was guarded at all times by a samurai. And there was one little bridge that connected Dejima to the rest of Japan. So essentially, you could not get in or out without express permission from the central government. So for the next century and a half, until the 1850s, essentially, the Dutch had exclusive access among European states to Japan. But as we're going to look at in the period of the Napoleonic Wars, that monopoly starts to get threatened.
I immediately want to ask kind of the whys of that, but I'm just curious before we get to that about whether that Dutch presence ends up being sort of subversive in any ways. Do we see sort of a seeping of European ideas into at least the discourse around sort of Japan and where it's going, or is that quite an effective kind of strategy of, keep them offshore, keep them heavily regulated, and therefore sort of preventing that, I guess not only sort of regulating that flow of goods, but also kind of making sure that Japan does retain its uniqueness during this period?
It was extremely effective at keeping any sort of large-scale European influence or invasion out at a time when Europeans were rapidly expanding, especially in Asia, especially in India, as we know as Brits. So the Japanese were limited, essentially, how many ships could arrive per year. Sometimes it was 2. When they felt more threatened, just 1. There was also a very limited number of people that lived on the island. We're talking about 15 to 20 individuals. And there was very strict regulations as to what sort of texts could be brought into the Japanese mainland. So the Japanese actually wanted to learn about European sciences, but they wanted to restrict the essentially European cultural influences, especially Christianity. The Bible was banned. In fact, in the archive where I found some of the texts for the research of this project, there was a tiny little Bible, probably a couple of centimeters by a couple of centimeters, which was in this archive. Essentially, it was so small because it was there to be snuck in between the robes of a European traveler so that they could sneak the Bible into Japan. Every year, the residents of Dejima would be permitted to do a tributary mission all the way to Edo, Edo being the pre-modern name for Tokyo. So that did offer a window into what the rest of Japan looked like. But again, they were escorted by guards and they couldn't really deviate from the planned tributary march. But Japanese scholars were very keen to learn about Western learning. In fact, it was called Rangaku. And several Japanese translators were trained in Dutch, but it was illegal for the Dutch residents of Dejima to learn Japanese.
Forgive
Ah,
me, I'm going
a
to take the
language
opportunity
barrier.
now to ask a sideways question. I'm interested. So this island of Dejima, even though it had 20 people, I'm curious to learn what happened to it in the Napoleonic Wars, because obviously in 1795 the Netherlands becomes the Batavian Republic, and then in 1806 the Kingdom of Holland ruled by Napoleon's brother. So what was the fate of Dejima?
So Dejima, this unique portal into the Japanese world for Europeans, starts to become threatened by two states in particular, that is Britain and Russia. For Russia, the buildup is a bit slower. Russia starts to expand its empire through Asia and Siberia in the 18th century, and in 1720 reaches the eastern coast of Asia in a place called Kamchatka. We're looking close to the Bering Strait. And essentially, the Russians are motivated by the fur trade. So they're following the furs, essentially massacring lots of furry little animals for the furs, which was a very profitable trade for the Russians. And they essentially follow this path of destruction all the way to North America, where, as we know, Alaska and what is actually less known, parts of California were colonized by the Russians in search of the sort of voracious appetite for furs in the European market. So the Russians start to become more despondent with the Dutch because they feel the Dutch, through Dejima, have essentially kept Japan for themselves. They haven't allowed many foreigners. Every so often, a foreigner is sort of allowed to pretend to be Dutch and end up in Dejima, but the Russians are usually not granted this privilege. So the Russians essentially have to rely on Japanese castaways, so usually fishermen that have been blown off course by storms and rescued in Russia to educate themselves on Japan. And in the 1730s, they actually set up a research institute, which is essentially taught by these Japanese fishermen to learn more about Japan. But these were not necessarily the greatest sort of Japanese academics they were utilizing to learn more about Japan. And again, they were very reliant on having to catch castaways, which was a very sort of rare occurrence. So it was not a very reliable source of information. So the Dutch in Dejima would become more insular when they realized that the Russians would start to open diplomatic missions to try and open Japan up to trade. Now, the first of these begin in the 1790s. So we're now in the Napoleonic period, I think, where the Russians send a delegation under a Finnish diplomat called Adam Laxman, who insists on opening trade. One of the other reasons here is that the islands north of Japan, the Kuril Islands, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, they're now disputed between Russia and Japan. Russia is starting to send fur trappers into these islands, and the Japanese are not particularly happy about this, but the Russians want to sort of regulate who controls these islands and access to the furs there. So Laxman arrives in Japan, but is seeking a trade agreement similar to what the Dutch have, but is rebuffed by the Japanese. Now, Laxman was pretty insistent and refused to leave without some sort of agreement. So the Japanese essentially gave some limited promises that if the Russians were to send a sort of more official delegate to Japan, that they might start to consider opening trade with Russia. Now, a lot happens in the 1790s in Russia, and obviously communications take about a year and a half to reach St. Petersburg. So this is really a story of what in the British Empire we'd call the man on the spot. So really decisions of small individual captains or governors making decisions without the authority of the central government. So in this case, it took several years for the Tsar to actually approve a proper diplomatic mission and appointed an ambassador called Nikolai Rezanov. And his mission was to circumnavigate the globe, sort of secure Russia's colonies in the Americas, especially in California, and open up relations with Japan. And Rezanov arrived in Nagasaki off the coast of Dejima to open negotiations. Now, the Dutch were not particularly happy about this because they had a unique position into Japanese life. And the Japanese were not particularly happy either, but they were scared of the insistence that Rezanov had, plus the fact that these Russian warships were considerably larger and more powerful than anything the Japanese had in their navy. So Rezanov's delegation essentially waited around 6 months in Nagasaki harbor for an official central government response, but were turned away. Rezanov was infuriated by this rejection, having sailed for several years around the world to get to Japan, and essentially sought vengeance on the Japanese and appointed 2 captains to begin essentially skirmishing and raiding Japanese islands in just sort of north of Japan, in Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. And they would sort of go off and carry out these orders and start to pillage these sort of very small Japanese outposts. Now, the other one you mentioned was about the fact that the Dutch essentially lost most of their Asian empire in the Napoleonic Wars. So, as you said, in 1795, the Netherlands becomes the Batavian Republic, and then later a French satellite, and then it's fully annexed by the French later, I think. This essentially means that the colonies that the Dutch have are now fair game to the British, and the British essentially start to go around hoovering up Dutch colonies in around the world, essentially, but especially in Indonesia. Following the loss of most of the Netherlands' Asian empire, Dejima has a certain uniqueness. In fact, many people in Dejima now see themselves as the only place in the world flying the Free Dutch flag, because the French now generally control the Netherlands and the British control all of the Dutch colonies. So yeah, it became a sort of point of pride for the few residents in Dejima. However, the nightmare of the Napoleonic Wars caught up with the residents of Dejima in 1808, when a British frigate, HMS Phaeton, entered Nagasaki harbor. Now, it did so under subterfuge. So it actually flew a Dutch flag, not to raise any suspicion. But then when it entered the harbor, quickly hoisted the Union Jack and demanded that the Dutch and Japanese resupply their ship. And it did so very violently. So the Dutch, the sort of manager of Dejima, came out on a rowing boat to meet HMS Phaeton, and the British took him hostage and threatened to hang him and essentially threatened to bombard the city if the Japanese did not meet Britain's demands, the ship's demands, even because again, we're not talking about something that necessarily had British government they were not following central government orders at this point. So the governor of Nagasaki had to make a quick call. He did not have sufficient troops, not sufficient cannons to effectively repulse HMS Phaeton, and was forced to resupply the British, who then promptly left, and for the shame of it would commit seppuku. And this is something you do see in the Shogun series. So seppuku is a sort of form of ritualized suicide for the sort of dishonor and shame of having essentially capitulated to Britain's demands. But this really sent shockwaves throughout Japan. I mean, Japan was already on tenterhooks. It had seen these large Russian ships attempt to open trade with them. It had its islands north of Japan raided by 2 Russian ships, and now this giant British warship had come into its harbor and threatened to essentially destroy Nagasaki. So for the Japanese, it was a very eye-opening moment, but it also opened their eyes to the inter-European rivalries that existed as well.
I want to stay with what sort of seems to be bubbling along under the surface of all of this, that the British appear to be, well, all the European powers appear to be doing that thing that we associate perhaps most with imperialism in the 19th century, i.e. you turn up at a place, provide an overwhelming show of force, and in the process you kind of do that shock and awe thing and encourage a local dignitary to sign a piece of paper that gives you access and, you know, various other rights depending on how much you um, feel emboldened to do. It's something that you see particularly along the coast of Africa on occasions. There are sort of echoes of what happens in New Zealand, where the British sort of turn up and sort of go, how about you sign this piece of paper that gives us access to all of this land? And the locals don't have that same kind of awareness of the idea that an individual can own the land because there's that cultural difference. So the where I'm going with this waffle really is kind of the technological disparity. And my gut, based on what you're saying, is that this is probably a result of that sort of isolationism. But at the same time, it sort of feels ever so slightly surprising. You talked already about how um, gunpowder's been around in China for centuries, isn't sort of embraced in quite the same way in Japan. But why is there this seemingly marked division? Is there just no need for the Japanese to develop um, armed forces built around gunpowder weaponry to the same degree that therefore means when the Europeans come knocking, there is this marked divide, or is there something else at play here?
When we look at the 1500s, as I said, the Japanese were very adept at adopting gunpowder weapons quickly. In fact, I would say that by 1600, by the time of Shogun, gunpowder is probably utilized more in Japan than it is in Europe, actually. But it is this relationship with gunpowder that it is a threat to the aristocracy, to the nobility, in a sense that the aristocracies in most countries are raised around the idea of being a martial force, like the knights in Europe or the samurai in Japan. You, as a young man, you're expected to spend your life training for warfare. And if some typical peasant in the Japanese system, they would call ashigaru, could be trained in 20 days to load a gun and shoot you, then the power structure is definitely impacted. And it certainly impacted Europe's structure too, when we look at how the aristocracy changed from the sort of knights of the Henry V sort of kind of knights of the 1400s to the more effete kind of aristocrats of 17th century Versailles. There is a large societal shift that occurs with the introduction of anti-cavalry weapons. We see it with the pike, with longbows, and then gunpowder is really the ultimate technology in this regard. Now, many samurai themselves actually do use gunpowder weapons. I think there's sort of this Tom Cruise version of history based on the Last Samurai, where there's this belief the samurai wouldn't touch or would consider it dishonorable to use gunpowder weapons, but it's not the case at all. Samurai actually did use guns, but it was more about keeping it out of the hands of the peasantry. There were also quite strict laws about hunting in Japan too at the time. So again, keeping weapons that could easily shoot deer out of the hands of the peasantry was also important in that regard too. About the maritime technology, though, there was already a considerable difference in the 1500s between Europe and Japan. I mean, Japan did have the Red Seal ships, which were oceanic ships that were used to conduct trade with China. So, and the Japanese did certainly adopt several European shipmaking techniques. But it's true that Sakoku really impacts the desire and the investment into building sort of more advanced warships, especially as Japan no longer has a serious need for a maritime force anymore, and it's not seeking to sort of expand its borders or trade internationally in the way that Europe was. So in this regard, there is a clear technological difference. Obviously, this is a period in which the Industrial Revolution is starting to kick off in Britain. I think that economically there might not be such a marked difference between the technologies between Europe and Japan, like there would be in the 1850s. And essentially, what HMS Phaeton does is it's a foreshadowing of the sort of gunboat diplomacy that you start to really see kick off in the 1840s when the British launched the first Opium War. And in 1853, it's actually when the Americans arrive in Tokyo and essentially forcibly open the Japanese up, and that the Japanese government cannot essentially resist the power of the American ironclads with rifled cannons. There is nothing they can do against these modern warships. So it's a foreshadowing of what's to come in many ways.
You get the impression of a very uneasy nation in these decades. So the Japanese are now establishing contacts, however informal and whether they like it or not, with several European powers. What is the Japanese policy towards this new political, but I suppose also cultural threat?
So they're not officially opening diplomatic relations. They're trying to keep the Russian diplomats at arm's length, and they're certainly not opening diplomatic relations with the British, who've just come in and threatened to, shell Nagasaki. But they are aware that they're there, and I think they're also aware that the Dutch are not particularly powerful actors, and that the Dutch also utilize their privileged permission to sort of make themselves look more important than they really were in European politics. But there's a sort of information asymmetry at this point. Now, for Europe, Japan is a complete sideshow, and it is a complete sideshow in the Napoleonic Wars. Not to denigrate the topic of today's discussion, it's not the center. It's not Borodino. It's not Waterloo. It's not Battle of Salamanca. The European wars are a largely European conflict, but certainly with a global element to it, which is important. So for the Europeans, Japan does not loom very high on the list of priorities during this giant conflict. But for Japan, which has limited interactions with the outside world, essentially what it is experiencing is a significant threat, and one that causes the intellectual class to discuss whether they need to change their policy, because there's many reformers that state that they need to be more open to the West so that they can actually copy European technology, so as to build up their own military forces and repel Europeans. It's something that which actually again will be discussed in the 1850s when the United States forcibly opens up Japan. And there's essentially attempts at censoring among the sort of wider society the news of these European incursions, but they were generally unsuccessful. The government starts to beef up its coastal defenses, realizing that they're very vulnerable to maritime invasion. But quite importantly, they start to suspend the authority of different daimyo, so these clan leaders, in areas they consider of strategic value and of potential danger to a Russian invasion. So the northern island of Hokkaido, so it's quite nowadays it's where the Japanese ski industry is. It's quite a snowy, cold, but large island. It's sort of right in the north of Japan, was ruled by a clan called the Matsumai, and their authority essentially was temporarily suspended when the central government brought in a bugyo. So bugyo is a sort of governor. It's technically a magistrate, but it's also a governor who essentially represents the central government, out of fear essentially that Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands would be the corridor through which Russia could potentially invade Japan.
I want to talk about that sort of risk of invasion, because the Japanese are obviously looking at this situation and nervous about it. But I'm at the risk of not the risk of it. We are descending in sort of counterfactuals and what ifs here. But how well prepared was Japan to face a force from a European power at this point? I completely take what you're saying, that it is not the be all and end all in terms of strategy during this period. Nobody, even Napoleon at this point in time, doesn't have sort of grand designs of, hey, we're going to go and take Japan. But nonetheless, if a sizable force were to land on the Japanese islands, how well equipped are the Japanese in terms of sort of organizing their forces to face such a threat? And also tactically, how would the two sides have matched up in terms of the way in which the Japanese are sort of preparing themselves and training their men for engagements during this period?
So, as you said, I think that the likelihood of a European invasion at this point was extremely unlikely. The Russians, as far as I can see, never planned a full-scale invasion, but there were these raids essentially, and there was limited combat and limited harassing of Japanese outposts. But I think that Japan would have been very ill prepared for a European invasion had a European country wanted to or had the capacity to launch a large-scale invasion. Now, I think it's unlikely because at this point it would have involved, a very large number of men on the other side of the world. So I don't think even Russia would have been capable of doing it in 1800. By the 1850s and 60s, they were easily eating away at Chinese territory in Manchuria. But that's a story of 50 years later. But the Japanese essentially become used to essentially a period of peace. The samurai class that had trained for war and had really been at their top in terms of proficiency in the 1500s had really become a administrative class, a class that was there to administer and rule the country, but were not really very keen or efficient combatants anymore at this point. There hadn't been much sort of levying of the peasant populace either. Many of the gunpowder weapons were obsolete. The powder quality was quite poor. This was observed in Golovnin's own diaries that the gunpowder that the Japanese used often would not project the cannonballs nearly as far as European powder would. So in many ways, they would have been at a disadvantage to repel the European invasion, which is essentially the same issue they had 50 years later when the Americans threatened to invade or at least bombard Japan.
There's very little being reciprocated from the Japanese in the way of friendliness towards the European powers. And as you also say, there wasn't much like tactical hope for their kind of for their excursions towards Japan. So what was the interest then from the likes of Russia in continuing to fund missions to Japan and raids? I mean, what were they actually gaining from this with a war raging in Europe at the same time?
Well, I think once the Rezanov mission had failed, I think that the Russians were pretty clued up to the fact that they were not going to get an official diplomatic mission that would open trade with Japan. So the Russian government instead decided to keep on plugging away at colonizing the Kuril Islands. So again, I've mentioned them a couple of times. So these small islands between Russia and Japan. And the reason why they came after these islands was that they were not clearly under Japanese authority. Some of the larger ones closer to Hokkaido were, but many of the other islands are much closer to Russia. Now, the reason why these islands were of interest was, again, for the fur trade and for resupplying goods, and also for some local trade with the indigenous people of the area. So these are the Ainu. And the Ainu themselves were not particularly fond of the Japanese. Many of them had been, the Ainu actually inhabited most of northern Japan and Hokkaido and had been pushed out by the Japanese. This is much, much earlier back. We're going into sort of ancient history now. But they'd essentially been pushed to the fringes of the islands by the Japanese. And several years before, or several years before essentially the Russian arrival, there had been a large-scale revolt of the Ainu against Japanese rule, which had been brutally crushed, and the ringleaders had all been beheaded. So there wasn't much love for the Japanese among the indigenous people. And as we'll later see with with another Russian mission, many of the Ainu were quite adept at picking up languages. So many of them learned both Russian and Japanese. So the mission that I would like to talk about today, because it is a particularly interesting one, is that of the Russian captain Vasily Golovnin. So Golovnin was a captain who had actually trained with the Royal Navy and had spent time among the British, and was commissioned by the Tsar to essentially do a cartographic mission of the Kuril Islands. So a lot of this northern Pacific area was not very well mapped and wasn't very well known by any European power. So it was important to improve the map so that Russian ships could easily sail between Kamchatka and East Asia and the western coast of North America, again, for the fur trade. So Golovnin was hired to essentially sail to Kamchatka and then begin his mapping mission. Now, after he'd left St. Petersburg, he had not been aware that Russia had actually switched sides in the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1807, Russia, which had been an opponent of France, signed the Treaty of Tilsit with the French, and essentially signing Russia up to the continental blockade against Britain. Now, this meant that the British now had a policy of impounding Russian as well as, of course, French ships. And so as Golovnin, who was completely unaware of the treaty at the time because there was really no means of him getting this sort of communication because he was already around the west coast of Africa at this point. When he arrived in Cape Town, which again is another example of a recent Dutch colony that had been annexed by Britain in the 1790s, his sloop, the Diana, was impounded by the British authorities, and he was kept there for 2 years. So it was actually, as we'll see later, a story of two captivities: a captivity by the British and then later by the Japanese. I think he was allowed a certain amount of liberty in Cape Town because he was able to organize an escape and was able to break the Diana out of its impoundment. And he was pursued by the Royal Navy, who then gave up the chase somewhere in the Indian Ocean, and eventually ended up in Kamchatka in 1810, 2 years behind schedule. So he promptly began his cartographic mission of the Kuril Islands, which leads us to the question of the captivity. So Golovnin's capture by the Japanese was very atypical. Most Japanese lords had been told to repel European ships, not to lure them onto shore and sort of entrap them. And this is actually the first contact that Golovnin had. He was actually shot at by Japanese cannon, who were trying to essentially, in their belief, drive off what they saw as a potential Russian invasion or a Russian raid. However, the next day, a Japanese delegation came onto the shoreline and essentially indicated to the Diana using lanterns that they were keen to open talks. So Golovnin, with several crewmates, decided to row ashore along with their Ainu translator. And there they dined with the local lord in the castle on the island. But just as the dinner was about to conclude and Golovnin returned to the Diana, the lord announced that he could not allow Golovnin to go back to Russia because he feared that he would, like some of the Russian ships before him, go on a sort of rampage, attacking Japanese outposts, and that if he released them at this point, he would also have to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, for allowing the Russians to leave. Now, I have some really good images on this from Waseda University Library. You can now find them on Google Images, but you have sort of these giant Russian figures being led by Japanese samurai who are at least depicted by the Japanese as much smaller than the Russians. And it sort of has a sort of outline of their different names and positions and essentially what's going on, written in the Japanese kanji script on the side, which is actually based off Chinese, but yeah.
Those images sound really interesting. What do you type in to find them?
I think you could just type in Vasily Golovnin captivity.
Oh, thank you.
But they're definitely worth a look, and I managed to get some high definition ones from the archivist in Waseda University Library, who kindly sent them to me. So yeah, Golovnin and his crewmates were transferred to Hakodate, which was the castle town on the island of Hokkaido, whilst the rest of the crew of the Diana, who had stayed on board the sloop, were able to escape unharmed and return to Kamchatka, where they would start to organize Golovnin's rescue mission.
I mean, it's a bloody long journey just to get immediately captured and imprisoned. There's no other question. What happens next? I mean, what becomes of him in this rescue mission?
Well, it's actually 2 years until the rescue mission actually gets underway, and Golovnin is kept in captivity in Hakodate. He is not brought to Tokyo or Edo to see the shogun, but he's kept at a sort of arm's length. But the central government, is quickly alerted to the fact that that they have captured these Russian sailors and that they are going to be interrogated by the Japanese. Now, the central government sends a Dutch-speaking scholar. So I'd mentioned earlier on that the several Japanese scholars were tasked with learning Dutch as part of this program of Rangaku. But they also sent a Japanese explorer. So this was a man called Mamiya Rinzo. So Rinzo himself had charted some of the islands of the Kurils and the island of Sakhalin, which is north of Japan. And he'd actually been present at some of the Russian raids that had happened several years earlier. So he was not particularly enamored by the Russians. In fact, in Golovnin's diaries, he sort of mentions Rinzo's coldness and that he didn't particularly get on well with him. So the translator and Rinzo interrogate Golovnin, not through torture, but just through sort of series of questions. And it's usually relatively amicable. And they have a large number of questions about Russian society, the Russian political structure, which is interesting because with the Dutch, they had generally been more inclined to learn about natural sciences, astronomy, medicine. But here they were very keen to know more about the what kind of state they were dealing with. Who are the Russians? Are they powerful? Are they a large state? Are they a threat? And so it was really an attempt to really gauge what kind of country they were dealing with. Moreover, the translator himself was also tasked with learning Russian, which also represents a sort of significant shift from the fact that before you were only allowed to learn Dutch. Now, Golovnin was kept in relatively comfortable accommodation, but he attempted an escape himself with his crewmates at night and spent several days wandering around the wilderness. Now, this was very unwise because they didn't really know where they were, and they were attempting to get to a small rowing boat. But also, as the only Europeans in Hokkaido, they were pretty noticeable by any of the peasantry. And so they were quickly alerted to the fact that they'd escaped, and within a few days they'd been captured, which earned them several days in the choky in the slightly tougher prison. But then they were pardoned, and I think the Japanese realized, and as did Golovnin and his crew, that there was no escaping essentially Hokkaido, and that they didn't really have the capacity to get out of captivity. So Golovnin, after that, was actually allowed a certain amount of liberty. So actually, he was allowed to roam the streets of Hakodate and really soak in a lot of Japanese culture in the area. This was really important because it really allowed him to write a very detailed diary of his experiences, which would become very important when he was finally released. Now, we also have to remember that whilst Golovnin is busy wandering the streets of Hakodate, Russia is in complete turmoil because we're talking about 1812 here. We have the French invasion, we have the Battle of Borodino, we have the burning of Moscow, and then obviously the French retreat. So this is complete asymmetry because the Russian government is is under threat from this French invasion. What's happening in Japan is of very little consequence to what the Tsar is thinking right now. Whilst for Japan, this single Russian captain is of great significance because it's one of their only sort of points of contact with Russia, and for them a potential invasion. So it's interesting to see the sort of asymmetry of the conflict. Now, Golovnin was eventually released, not necessarily out of the sort of goodness of his captors' hearts, who they did not really want Golovnin to go back to Russia, considering how immersed he'd been in Japanese culture, and especially in a area of geostrategic importance to Japan. But what had happened is, after his captivity, the crew of the Diana had alerted the local governor, the governor of Kamchatka, who had begun to sort of seek leverage towards doing a prisoner exchange with the Japanese. Now, to do this, the Diana effectively kidnapped a wealthy Japanese merchant called Takadaya Kahei, and brought him back with his crew in captivity in Kamchatka. And actually, the Russians did not, surprise, surprise, keep their Japanese prisoners in as good conditions as the Japanese were keeping the Russians. And several crew members died of scurvy in captivity in Kamchatka, which was essentially of great significance because it meant that they had less bargaining power to negotiate with the Japanese. But eventually, the Diana was able to make contact with the Japanese and organize a prisoner exchange releasing the Japanese captives in exchange for Golovnin and his crew, which eventually occurred in October 1813.
So what's the longer term impact then of Golovnin's captivity?
Well, the immediate impact was because it takes years to get anywhere from Eastern Russia and Japan to Europe is not immediate. So Golovnin eventually returns to St. Petersburg in 1814. So at this point, the French have retreated and Russia is a little safer. And he starts to pen his best-selling book. So what will become best-selling book in the end. So it's definitely one of those sort of forgotten books that you really have to kind of go into an archive to find. But in its time, it was translated into several languages and really became a sort of bestseller in the post-Napoleonic years, mostly because it was one of these unique insights into a culture which most Europeans had never really heard of or not really had any experience with. And so it really became very, very, very popular. And it did a lot to sort of undermine the Netherlands' monopoly that they had on Dutch relations. In fact, many Russian memoirs, especially Golovnin's, were pretty critical of the Dutch for not having done more to sort of educate Europeans on Japanese society. In Japan, however, the quite the opposite happened. Rather than opening themselves up to more knowledge of Europe, the shogunate brought in more and more edicts that would essentially push local rulers to kill any Europeans on arrival if they arrived, or repel ships if they were to approach the Japanese coastline. So in a sense, there's a paranoia about the stability of the regime and the fear that Europeans will essentially disrupt the social fabric of the country. So there are several cases. I think I've forgotten a name, but the first European woman to reach Japan is who was actually allowed access to Nagasaki by the local governor, is then actually expelled when the central government finds out, because generally in colonial history, women equals essentially an attempt to colonize, because they see it most. I think the Japanese rulers saw the fact that European women was there as that she could potentially have children, and that the Europeans could essentially start to dig roots into Japan, which was not something they wanted. And so generally there was a greater suspicion of European encroachment, which would only finally end in 1853 by force. So this is Commodore Matthew Perry, not the one from Friends, who was on a mission to China but stopped in Japan on his way and came in with what the Japanese called the Black Ships. Now, what I actually really love about the Japanese is that whenever there was a sighting of a European ship, they always did these really beautiful artworks and sketches of the boats, which are still available today and have really been really well preserved. And so you can see sketches of the Diana, you can see sketches of the Russian ships that attempted to get in, of HMS Phaeton, the British ship, and also of these American ironclad ships that came into Tokyo Harbor in the 1850s. And this was really the most successful attempt to open Japan, as it realized that it really couldn't stop Europeans entering with such powerful ships. And the Americans actually demonstrated the power of their rifled cannons on I think a small shed or a small hut outside of Tokyo, just to show the sort of level of their firepower and to impress the Japanese. So this would ultimately put Japan on a path towards the end of the shogunate system, the restoration of the emperor as the main political figure, and as well as Japan's rapid westernization and also Japan's transformation into an aggressive empire, which would then start to take its revenge on most of the Western neighbors, as well as its Asian neighbors too.
What a fascinating part of history, and indeed, what a fascinating episode. Dr. Thomas Gidney of the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Thomas, you've been wonderful to have on.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really fun to discuss this not so well-known topic.
Definitely. His book is entitled An International Anomaly, Colonial Accession to the League of Nations. It's nothing to do with what we've talked about today, but nonetheless, do check it out when it's published sometime early next year. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening, and we shall see you next time.
Hello again, folks. Please remember, we're still fighting back from that Spotify nightmare. So please do two really simple and quick things to help us rise from the ashes. First, whack that subscribe button, especially if you're listening to this on Spotify, because you're likely to have been disconnected. But whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on, please just do it anyway to make sure you can stay connected to us. Second, like and leave a comment. It helps bump us up the algorithm to reconnect with our lost audience. If you're a fan of the show, you can leave a 5-star review. Go on, you know you want to. And did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and all the hot gossip about what's coming soon? Because let's be honest, this show is all about the hot gossip. To sign up, go to www.thenapoleonicwars.net. Much love to all my Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording this in mid-August 2024, are in the mentioned and dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Mars Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals: John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Laird Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically named Zed. And I promise that's not just me boosting the numbers. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.